Hi patrons, welcome back to another tutorial series. So in this tutorial series we're going to be doing another colour pencil portrait, and this time we're going to be drawing Will Smith because a lot of you guys wanted to see a different type of skin tone being drawn, and I also had a lot of requests to show you how to draw facial hair and like afro sort of hair, different sort of texture to the hair. So I thought this portrait would incorporate all of those sorts of things so I could answer a lot of your sort of requests and questions doing this portrait. So as always, the first part that we're going to be working on is the eyes. We're going to get them blocked in, and firstly I want to run through the colours that I'm going to be using for the eye section and the skin around the eyes and the eyebrows. So firstly we've got the black pencil, and also we're going to be using one Prismacolor pencil in this set because I didn't have any more of the Sepia by Caran d'Ache Luminance, so I'm using the Dark Umber Bright Prismacolor, and I'm also going to be using Burnt Sienna, and these three colours are what we're mainly going to be using to do the iris. So we've got that lighter brown, then the darker brown and the sort of black, and this is more of like a reddy brown. And so for the skin tones, I've got a lot of different colours. We're going to be using Burnt Sienna 10%, Burnt Ochre 10%, and Brown Ochre 10%. So those are the first three light shades. We're also going to be using the Burnt Ochre 50%, the Brown Ochre 50%, and we're going to be using the Brown Ochre and the Burnt Ochre. So we've also got these mid-tone values and the shadowed values as well. For the white of the eye, we're going to be using a few different greys in there as well. We're going to be using the French grey 10% and just the French grey to get in some of the mid-tones and the more shadows in the white of the eye. And also we're going to be using the Raw Umber 50% for some of the more green undertoned areas, and also the colour Russet for some more saturated red areas. We're also going to be using the Olive Brown 10% and a white pencil mainly for blending. We won't be using this too much because there's not a lot of white, but we're mainly going to be using it to blend out the lightest areas like the white of the eye. So those are the colours that we're going to be using for this part. If you guys missed out on one of my tutorials from a previous tutorial series where I went about telling you how I choose my colours for my colour pencil portraits and how I chose the skin tone colours for this specific portrait, then I recommend you check that one out, and that will give you more of an idea of how you should go about picking colours for your future portraits. So now that I've shown you all of the colours, let's get into it. And the first thing that I'm going to work on is getting in the darkest shadows and getting in the iris. So if we go in first with our black pencil, you can see on the reference which I've attached as well as the sketch outline that the darkest areas is the lash line and the pupil and the outer edge of this iris, and also the crease as well. First thing that I did though was I did lighten up the sketch using a kneaded eraser. I just used the kneaded eraser and wiped it over the pencil sketch to lighten it up a bit so that the pencil lines won't show through any of the lighter areas of shading. So let's go in with our black pencil and let's first lightly use it to get in that darker lash line. I'm not applying much pressure, especially because we're doing the first sort of a layer. So I'm using the reference and my sketch outline to guide me as to where I need to apply this. I apply a bit more on the really dark areas, but I'm not applying more pressure. I'm just using more circular motions to fill in all of that white grain. The dark black doesn't really go all the way down into the corner, so I'm not going to follow it all the way down. And as I said, it goes quite a lot into the iris. So I'm lightly going to shade that in. I did block out with my sketch where the highlights are so that we don't get them too dark and we can go around them. So we're just looking at the darkest points here. apply a bit more pressure where it looks the darkest. So I'm just looking for the black areas at the moment. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go in with burnt sienna, and I just want to use that to fill in the iris where you can kind of see on the reference photo that there's lighter areas of the iris. It's all pretty dark anyway, but there is these lighter areas, and I'm just going to burnish this pencil into sort of the lower middle part. But I'm not applying loads of pressure so that we can't add layers over the top. I'm just making sure that I fill in all of the white grain using as little pressure as I can. So just fill in the whole of that iris. I'm also going to use a brush to wipe away those little bits of coloured pencil. So now I'm going to go in with my brown pencil and use that to get in some of these darker shadows. This is the Prismacolor pencil. And so I'm just looking at the reference and picking out some of these darker shadows and getting them in. So that's mainly around the outer edge of the iris and towards the centre where the pupil is. And I'm also going to add this brown up on top of this lash line, and more for those shadows on the crease where it was quite dark but not really black. So I want to lightly get in that as well. So all of these shadows just shade with this brown pencil. So the brown goes further down to the inner corner of the eye as well. And start to begin adding the shading up towards the eyebrow just a little bit. Okay, so now I want to go back in with the black pencil and use that to darken up some of these shadows in the iris. So again, darken up the outer edge. And the pupil. And I'm pressing down quite hard now because we don't need to apply lots of layers on top of this. Shade a bit more black on this lash line, especially a bit on the crease where those darkest points are on the crease. So a little bit over here, just a tiny bit though, just to darken it up. Again, use our brush to wipe off all of the bits. Now I just want to add a bit of highlight into the eye. There isn't much, but just on this side a little bit, tiniest bit, and also just brighten up the highlights. I'm going to go over it with the burnt sienna as well, tone it down. So now I want to work on the white of the eye. So the first thing that I want to do is lay down the grey across both sides. So this is the French grey 10%, which was our lighter grey that we chose. So I just want to get a base tone down with this. Again, I'm not applying lots of pressure, go in those circular motions. Now I'm going to apply a bit more pressure to where it's more shadowed, but not too shadowed. Like, for example, this left-hand side is darker than the right-hand side. So I'm going to burnish the lighter areas of the left-hand side, but leave the darkest bits unburnished so I can add a bit more of the just French grey, the darker grey that we chose. And use it to add a bit of shadow over here as well. And blend that out with the French grey 10%. So what I want to do is add that bit of reddish pink tinge. So I'm going to go in with the colour Russet and just glaze a bit of that in this corner. And also use the burnt sienna to blend over that. Also add a bit of that dark umber, that Prismacolor. And finally just a bit of the burnt sienna 10% to add a pinkish tinge over those lighter areas. And now let's work on this side over here. So this is much lighter, so I'm going to blend out that grey with the white pencil. Blend that out, and let's work on the inner corner. So I'm going to use the burnt sienna for this. Because it's also got like a warmish tone to it, I'm going to go in with the burnt ochre 50%, because as we said in the last tutorial, if you want orangey sort of tones to your skin, use the burnt ochres. Also going to use a bit of burnt sienna 10%. So now let's move on to the eyelid. I just want to actually add a bit more, another layer of shadow to this side just to darken it up a tiny bit. There we go. So let's work on the upper eyelid. So I'm going to go with some burnt ochres because it is quite warm toned, quite orange toned. So let's layer the burnt ochre 50% over these mid-toned areas. I'm leaving out the middle sort of section because that's more highlighted. I am going to add a bit more burnt sienna to this upper lash sort of line, and add a bit of that darker brown to the darkest points. Going to add a bit of burnt ochre to integrate between these areas a bit smoother. So again, let's go in with that burnt ochre, shade that along here. Want to add a little bit of brown over the top just to tone down the orange a bit. And I'm going to blend over that and towards the middle with the brown ochre 10%. So as you can see, we now have a natural highlight towards the center, and we've toned down some of that orange. I'm going to go over it again with the burnt ochre 50% in this corner and in this corner over here, and also add a bit of just the burnt ochre for these darker areas. I really do recommend planning out the colours that you're using. It will save you so much time and save you making mistakes in the execution sort of phase of the drawing. Now I'm adding the burnt sienna to add more of that reddish brown tinge to it and darken up the crease once again. Also add some shadow here and over the upper lash line. Okay, so now let's add a bit of colour underneath the eye. So again, it's quite warm tone, quite orange tone, so I'm going to start with a layer of the burnt ochre 50%. All that's different with the darker skin is that you use more of the darker pencils. Like, I'm still using the same sort of colours like the burnt ochres, brown ochres, burnt siennas, but I'm not using the 10% as much. I'm using more of the 50% for the base tones and just using those lighter colours, those 10% as the sort of highlight tone. Whereas with lighter skin, I'd use like the 10% as the base tone and go over with a white or something for the highlights. So I'm getting in some of these shadows by applying more layers of that pencil, not more pressure, just more layers. Just go in with the burnt sienna as well. This could do with going in a pencil extender actually. Give me more control. I do like pencil extenders if I want more control, and it helps you guys see it better. So I'm just adding all of the shadowed areas with the burnt sienna. So there's more shadow up here as well. So just block that in, and over here we have a bit of shadow which we've already sketched in for our sketch outline, so it's easier to spot. So what I want to do is I want to also add a bit of raw umber 50% to this area because it is a bit more green sort of undertoned. So I'm just shading a tiny little bit just under this crease. We're not going to do too much of the skin around the eyes because we'll do that when we do more of the skin. So now I want to blend the highlighted areas out in this inner corner with the brown ochre 10% like we did with the upper eyelid. I'm not doing it too hard. Go across to this side. And I'm going to use the burnt ochre 10% to blend this side over here. Just a little bit. Go back in with the burnt ochre 50% to add these shadows. Add a bit of the burnt sienna. Blend that with the burnt ochre 50%. and I'm going to use the darker Prismacolor brown to create this crease, this dark crease here as well. And also glaze some shadow. Also start to add a bit of shading for that shadow over there. And just add a bit of shadow under here. Add a bit more shading in the inner corner of the eye. And add a tiny bit of shading just below it. I'm going to blend that out a bit with the burnt sienna 10% and glaze a bit of the burnt ochre 50% over the top, and add a bit of the burnt ochre. So I'm adding a bit of burnt ochre 50% over this shadow that we've created. But as you can see, the inner corner of the eye is quite light. So we're going to leave that for now. Add a bit of this shadow. And for that, I'm going to actually add a bit of the brown ochre 50% for these shadows up here. But for that highlight, I'm just going to go over it with the brown ochre 10%. Go back in with the burnt ochre 50% and the burnt ochre. Add some burnt ochre 50% just around under here as well. It starts to get a bit warmer. Also add some of that burnt ochre. Slightly lighter over here, so move over to the burnt ochre 50%. And I'm going to blend over this little crease with the burnt ochre 10% to add a bit of a highlight. Add some burnt sienna for these shadows down here now. So I want to shade in the burnt ochre 50% for this area. for this shadow. Going to shade a bit of burnt sienna for the shadow here as well. Go over that, darken that up. Going to add a bit of burnt ochre for the more saturated and darker warm orange areas. Also go in with the burnt sienna a bit as well. So I'm going to start to apply more pressure to the burnt sienna for these shadowed areas. But I'm not completely burnishing because I'm going to go over it with some of the burnt ochre. I am getting quite a thick layer, a dark layer in. So now let's go over that with the burnt ochre and use that to fill in quite a bit of this white area. Leaving a tiny bit at the end. I'm going to add the burnt ochre 50% for that because it's a bit lighter. So I'm glazing over some burnt ochre for all of these areas that are a bit more orange toned and are quite dark. Now I'm blending over that with the burnt ochre 50%. Starting to burnish out these areas now. Not so much that we can't glaze a few of the colours on top though. So as you can see, I haven't coloured in the middle bit because that's our lightest area. And to do that, I'm going to go in first with a light layer of the burnt ochre 10%. And then I'm going in with the brown ochre 10%. And as you can see, I'm slightly going over to the other areas to make it more of a soft transition. There's also a bit of yellow tone as we go up from here. So I'm going to start that off. Going to add a bit more burnt sienna to darken it up a bit. Go over this crease as well. Going to add a bit of burnt ochre 50% over the highlighted area. And I'm also going to add a bit of this brown to darken it up. I'm going to add the bit of highlight here. Now I'm adding a bit of russet to make it more of a saturated, vibrant colour. Just glazing using the side of the pencil. Now I'm going to shade some of the brown to the shadow in this corner. Blend over that in the opposite direction than what I put the pencil strokes in, just to blend that out. Going to add a bit of the brown ochre 50% as well to blend in up into that area where we're going to start to add more yellow, and same thing down here. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the crease with the burnt ochre 50% to tone it down a bit. Add some burnt ochre here. Just adding a bit of burnt sienna to darken up that side. Okay, so now let's move on to working on the eyebrow. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the skin above the eyebrow. So that's quite yellow toned. So I'm going to shade in some of the brown ochre 50% just above it. But then towards the left hand side it becomes more warm toned, more orangey. So I'm going to also get in some of the burnt ochre 50% on the left hand side, because it's quite shadowed. Also adding some burnt ochre and some burnt sienna. And a little bit of brown. I'm going to burnish this area with the brown ochre 10%. Okay, so moving on to the eyebrow. So it's quite dark, so what I'm going to do is add a base layer of the burnt sienna first. Let's get in a bit of that burnt sienna to block in where this eyebrow is. I'm also going to go over that with some of the raw umber 50%. So this acts as a nice underbase for the eyebrow. So now I'm going to start to add the eyebrow hairs, firstly using the dark umber. So I'm looking at the direction they're going in. My pencil's nice and sharp. So I always like to get that sort of base tone down and then just add the hairs over the top, so that we don't have any white bits showing through and we don't have to go through and try and fill in all of the white bits afterwards. I'm adding some of those stray eyebrow hairs over the top as well, and also underneath. That's important that it doesn't just look like a uniformed shape put on top. It needs to look natural. Add some of the burnt ochre to tie it in with the skin. And also some of that burnt sienna. Add some of these other little hairs. Now I'm going to go in with the black pencil and darken up some of those eyebrow hairs. So let's go over them, darken them up. Still look at the direction they're going in and follow that. Look at where there are the darkest eyebrow hairs. So I'm also adding a bit of shadow down here just to darken that up a bit. I just want to add a bit of brown just to darken this up a little bit, this shadow down here. Just glaze it over a bit. I'm not pushing down at all. I just want to lightly add some of the brown. Now going in lightly with the burnt ochre to transition it a bit better into that highlighted area. I want to glaze a bit more of the colour russet over this side and add a bit more sepia. Go over that with the burnt ochre. There we go. Now I'm just pulling up some of the lightest areas with a bit of the white. I feel like this area is a bit too light though. So I'm going over it with the burnt ochre 50%. Going to add a bit of the French grey 10% here actually. There we go. So now I'm going to move on to the next eye. Now that we've done that completely, let's move on and do it all again. You can do it this way, or you can decide that you want to do it at the same sort of time. Do one stage on one eye, then go and do it on the other eye. It's completely up to you. So before we start, I just want to sharpen that black pencil because that's what we're going to be going in with first. We're going to be doing it in the exact same sort of order with the eye. We might use slightly different colours, but we're going to do it in the same order. So first thing I want to do is clean up where some of this colour pencil smudged. Don't know when that happened, but just clean that up a bit. Shouldn't really matter anyway. So let's go in with the black pencil, and again the same places are the darkest, so the upper lash line. Down a bit onto the bottom, but mainly just on the top here, the iris. So let's colour in all of these really dark areas. Go around these highlights. Press a bit harder on this upper lash line to darken that up. And so now I'm going to go in with that burnt sienna again and fill in the iris. Just go over the whole thing apart from the highlights. Now go in with the brown pencil and work on adding a bit of the shadows. But mainly we're going to add the shadows with the black again. I always find that the second eye gets done a bit faster than the first, because you've got to grips with the process and you just repeat it. So the highlight isn't actually that bright, so I'm going to go over it with the white, but I'll incorporate, as you can see, it'll incorporate some of that black into it, so it's a bit more toned down. And I'm going to make them a bit smaller with the black pencil. There we go. So now I just want to lighten it up a bit. Going to go in with the brown ochre 50% and just use that to lighten the bottom a little bit. There we go. So now that we've got the iris done, I'm going to go over it a bit again with the burnt sienna. So now let's work on the, what did we do last time? Doesn't matter, I'm going to work on the white of the eye now. Firstly going in, actually no, we did the crease, didn't we? So now then it's easier to judge. So to do the crease, what I want to do first is go in with this brown pencil and get in the shape of the crease. Apply a bit more pressure to the darkest points. Make sure I've got that nice and thick. Going to darken up this area as well inside the eye. Okay, so I'm going to do the white of the eye now. So let's go in again with our grey pencil and use that to add our base tone. A nice even coverage on both sides. This side is darker, so I'm going to burnish with this pencil. And go over with the darker grey to add the shadows. Then you can blend that out again with the lighter grey. Because it's got a bit more of a brownish orange tone, I'm going to add a bit of the burnt sienna to that corner as well. And a bit of that brown. And I'm also adding some burnt sienna 10% because it's got a bit more of a pink tinge to it as well. Can add a bit of shading with the brown on this side. Gonna add the burnt sienna 10% on this corner because it's quite pink in this corner. Again, I'm gonna add more pressure to the lighter grey. And add a bit of darker grey at the top and in the inner corner where it is a bit more shadowed. Blend that out with that lighter grey. And add a bit more pink. I'm going to neaten up the shape of the upper lash line. So the tear duct is a bit more reddish tone, so I'm going to use a bit of the russet colour to get in that initial saturation and go over it with a bit of the burnt sienna to tone it down and dull it down a tiny bit. I'm going to blend over that with the burnt sienna 10% and darken the darkest parts up with the burnt sienna again, and also a bit of the brown. And I want to add that tiny highlight to the middle with the white pencil. Just use that to lighten up that area a bit. Now let's move on to the upper eyelid. Might just add a tiny bit of shadow down with the burnt sienna. But now let's move on to the upper eyelid. And so I'm going to be using similar colours to before. Firstly, add the shadows with the burnt sienna on this side. Only a tiny bit because it is a lot lighter than the other side in that corner, so we don't need to apply as much pressure. Go over the crease as well. So I'm going to start with a layer of the burnt ochre 50%. Leave a bit out in the middle for the highlight and blend out this side as well. Then for the middle, let's use that brown ochre 10%. Let's give us that nice highlight in the middle. Transition with the burnt ochre 50%. Soften that out. Want to add a bit of the brown over this to make it a bit less orange toned. And also let's darken up the crease. And thicken up the lash line as well. Let's go in with the burnt ochre. Use that to add the more shadowed areas. Blend over that lightly with the burnt ochre 50%. And so now as we get towards the inner corner, it's a bit more yellow tone. So let's add the brown ochre 50% because it's not too highlighted at the moment. So let's just add that tone and bring that up a bit onto this bottom lid. So again, let's go in with the burnt ochre 50%, start to really add a base layer to this bottom eyelid. Add in the burnt sienna now for the shadows. There's a few creases as well here. So here it turns a bit more yellow tone, so we're going in with the brown ochre 50%. So in the middle it's a bit more highlighted, so again I'm going to go in with that brown ochre 10% to create that look of a natural highlight in the middle. Use that to blend out the rest of the area as well, lightly. Going to go back over with that burnt ochre 50%. And let's shade with the burnt sienna. So now I want to go in with that darker brown and use that to darken up these creases. Also go over the iris again because it might have got a bit blurry from doing the white of the eye. The white of the eye is a bit too light, so I'm going to glaze a bit of the brown over it and blend that out with the lighter grey. Okay, so below the creases, it's more yellow tone. So I'm going to set us up for that later on with a bit of the brown ochre 10%, and I'll add some 50% in a second as well. So this corner is lighter, so I'm going to just use the burnish that into this corner because it's a lot lighter. Just the highlighted section. And let's go in with the brown ochre 50%. Go over with a bit of the brown ochre on these creases and up here, and finally add a bit of the burnt ochre to help transition and start to lead into the yellow rather than it just being orange toned and then just jump to the yellow tones. So I want to add a bit of brown for the creases. Shade in some shadows for that. Add the highlight in the middle between them though. There's a lighter section between them. I'm going to go over with the burnt sienna, go over those shadows. Go in with the burnt ochre. A little bit of brown in between here. Don't want it to look so smooth. Add a bit of texture. So now I'm going to move on to the upper eyelid now. So like before, I started by getting in some of these shadows using the burnt ochre. So because it's very warm toned, we're using the burnt ochres, and because it's quite shadowed, we're using just the burnt ochre, not the burnt ochre 10% or 50%. So now we've got the base layer of that down. I also want to add a base layer of the burnt ochre 50% because it does start to get a bit more yellow toned around this area. I'm going to switch back to the burnt ochre. Also go in with the burnt sienna now to add these more shadowed areas. So now I'm going to blend over that with the burnt ochre 50%, but before I do that I just want to sharpen it a bit. So blend and burnish that out. And towards the middle here, I'm going to go in again with the brown ochre 10%. Let's just use that. So I'm just blending and getting it to look a bit softer. So let's go in with that burnt sienna and use that to add some darker shadows. Let's darken up these shadows, darken up the crease a bit as well. Adding in the little creases to the side as well. In between the creases it's a bit highlighted, so just add them in. So the side over here, I'll just brush away the bits. So the side here is quite warm toned as well, so I'm going to burnish that out with the burnt ochre 50%. as we go inside, it becomes more yellow toned. So I'm first going to go in with the brown ochre 50%. But mainly blend the middle bit with the brown ochre 10%. Gonna add a bit of the burnt ochre here. Gonna add a bit of burnt ochre down here as well. And so the creases go over this sort of edge. They go fainter and fainter though as you go along. I'm going to add a bit of brown for the shadow. So now let's move on to the eyebrow. So again, I'm looking above the eyebrow. Let's see what shades it is to this side, and it is a bit more warm orange tone. So let's go in with the burnt ochre just a little bit. And also I want to add a bit of raw umber. I want to blend that out a bit with the brown ochre 50%. So to this side it is again more yellow tone, so we're going to start off with the brown ochre 50%. Just shade that all the way around. Go over now with the brown ochre 10%. Going to shade with a bit of the burnt ochre 50%. Just blend that out and blend over it with the brown ochre 50%. Again, we want to darken this up a bit, so let's go in with the brown ochre. And the burnt sienna. Now I'm going in with the burnt ochre 50% again. And also going over it with a little bit of white just in this lightest area here, just a tiny bit, just lighten that up. And so now let's move on to working on the eyebrow. So again, let's add our base tones to this. We're going to use the burnt sienna and the raw umber again. Burnt sienna, raw umber 50%. Blend them together with the brown ochre 50%. Glaze some burnt ochre up to the eyebrow, and on the other side. Let's add the burnt ochre 50%. Let's add the white pencil as well. So now let's actually build up these eyebrow hairs and do it in the same way. First, let's go in with that dark umber, that Prismacolor. Just use that to block them in, look at the direction they're going in. You already have the sort of shape that they need to fill, so that makes it a lot easier. Add the shapes of the creases as well. These deep creases. Add the shadows in this inner corner as well of the eye. Now let's go in with the black pencil and do the same thing as last time. Look for those darkest areas and just darken them up. Now I'm shading a bit more brown. Blend over that with the burnt ochre 50%. And I'm going to add in some of the lighter areas. Gonna go in with the white and just lighten it up a little bit. Add in the white pencil now just to add a bit more of a highlight. Going over it with the brown ochre. Okay, so now I'm just looking around the drawing, seeing if there's anything I want to adjust before we move on to the next step. Obviously we can adjust things as we go if we notice anything. Like I noticed that I just want to darken up that bit of the white of the eye. And add a bit more brown. Just darken up the iris. I'm going to add a little bit of the colour Russet just to give a more saturated look in this corner. Just in here as well. Add a bit of black to the crease, to these darkest points. So that's basically it for this first part. We've got the eyes done now, and what we're going to move on to next is doing the nose. If you've been watching a lot of my coloured pencil tutorials on Patreon, you'll know that I do it in a certain sort of method. Always eyes, then nose, mouth, then the face, then the ears, then the hair, and then the sort of body. Darken up these highlights. I'm actually going to go in with a white gel pen. So just to add a few of the highlights. So there's a bit of highlight here. It's not too much. Make a few final adjustments. But that's it for now, guys, and I'll see you in the next part. Bye, everybody.